even further than King Asa. That excellent series from John and the description of what Asa did. Well, basically, Josiah exceeded that. Well, shall we turn then to the subject of the reign of Edward VI? If we could have him first of all. There he is. So he came to the throne in January 1547, the day, in fact, of Henry's death. His coronation was a month later, on the 20th of February. And just as Henry had, he had privy councillors. And I want to come back to those later on. They're like the cabinet, if you like, in our present age, the senior ministers, if you like, of state. The council invested, first of all, Edward Seymour, the uncle of Edward, it's him, as Lord Protector. Now, this was usual for a child coming to the throne. We only have to go back to Richard III. At first, remember, he was the protector of Edward V. Now, I don't want to say any more about that, about what happened subsequently, but that was what he was originally, the protector of Edward V as a young child. So he was 9-year-old when he came to the throne. His other uncle was Thomas Seymour, who became Lord Admiral and was later married to the Queen, Catherine Parr. I'll say more of those later. So as you see from the photograph, or from the painting rather, he was a small child from the beginning in poor health most of his life. And yet, in his age, there were real reforms. Remember, in Henry's time, there was a dissolution of the monuments, of the monasteries, and there was a Bible that maintained for quite a long time, Coverdale Bible to 1571. But that apart, very few genuine reforms. So what about his reforms? Well, again, his career has been favorably compared with Josiah. Our reading, Josiah was king of Judah from 639 to 609 BC. And as I said, he exceeded really the reforms of King Asa in removing the high places, the centers of idolatry in Israel, and indeed beyond Israel. But Edward was 8-year-old when he became king. And that contrasted, well, that was the same age, given a few months as Josiah. But the difference is, of course, that Josiah then went on to reign for another 30 years. Sadly, that was not the case with King Edward. His protector, Somerset, or at least his first protector, because there was another one later, and his successor, John Dudley, Earl of Warwick at the time, who became Duke of Northumberland, were what I would call political Protestants. But that didn't just apply to those two. It also applied to many members of the Privy Council, unfortunately, of Edward. They were there, in fact, because of the king's Protestantism. It was expedient for them to express their Protestant views, though, as I say, they weren't genuine in a lot of cases. So that was the background to the Reformation, which is certainly not a very promising one. Edward remained, as Henry had, head of the church. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the next one who I mentioned before, Cranmer. He remained basically in charge of the Reformation procedure. These were initiated by Edward and the council and passed down to Cranmer in particular to implement. Now, I've not been uncritical of Cranmer, and I'm afraid I'm going to continue in that way for a while. It is said he came to Protestant views slowly in 1533, which was the year that Henry married Anne Boleyn after his divorce from Catherine. Now, I think there was considerable vacillation after that. He was not the best architect, in my opinion, for reform. On one occasion, he used the Erastian principle to justify what he was doing. That is the interference of state, and the interference particularly of the Privy Council in the proposals of reform that some held. And this was to curb the views of some evangelicals who wanted more radical reform. So there was a break on what was going on, really. Some good things, yes. Erastianism has been a problem for the church since 325 AD. That is the reign of Constantine, when the close association of state and church began to occur. And sadly, it's continued through the centuries. Particularly unpleasant is the involvement of the state in discipline in the church. And even in Calvin's Geneva, this occurred on at least one occasion. Well, this is what Cranmer used to curb the views of those who perhaps were more radical. And one of them certainly, and I'm coming back to him in a moment, was Bishop John Hooper, the Bishop of Gloucester, who certainly wanted further reforms in the Church of England. So let's look at the key events of this particular situation and reign. First of all, a very good thing in 1549, so it took 2 years, there was an act of uniformity. And in that act of uniformity, the Catholic Mass was prohibited. Remember, the opposition caused the death of many in Henry's reign, even women in this particular case. But of course, there were a lot more in Mary's reign. The clergy, so-called, were ordered to remove icons from churches. So we're back to Josiah again, and the statues of saints. But there was also a book, or a revisal of the Book of Common Prayer. This was the prayer book of Edward VI. And it was introduced to English church services, which were liturgical, and brought into line with Reformation teaching. So that was a good thing. But there was still an opportunity for expository preaching, as well as the prayer book services. The Great Bible, as I mentioned earlier, of Coverdale, was in use from 1540, and it was used in the church well into Elizabeth's reign in 1571. Well, a good thing here was the 42 articles that were composed by Cranmer. As I say, I'm ambivalent about Cranmer, but this was a good thing. Basically, they were produced in 1550, and they've been described as an expression of moderate Calvinism. Later, they were reduced to the 39, which are in operation in the Church of England at the moment. And all I can say about those 39 articles, if they were genuinely followed by the incumbents, then the Church of England would be transformed even in our days. Just a little anecdote. The chap with whom I was co-pastor in Hartlepool, Tom Johnson, had a friend who was in a local Anglican church. And he was asked, Tom asked him about the 39 articles, and his response was, we sign them with mental reservations, and I fear that many do in our own day and generation. In fact, the same man declared further that apart from papal infallibility, he was a Roman Catholic, sadly. But anyway, nothing wrong with these articles. And there was the opportunity, as I say, to proclaim the doctrines of grace recovered by the reformers. But then, let us look at the reformers themselves. I've mentioned Cranmer. It is described that he came slowly to Protestant persuasion, that is the view of Ryle. But Somerset and the Privy Council held him back over more radical reforms. His work on basically the prayer book and 42 articles was good and to be admired. But there were certainly some very dubious decisions before that. And I want to come to this in the final point. That is the sending of Anne Askew, or sometimes called Ayscough, and Joan Botcher to the stake. I believe that sadly Cranmer was a flawed man who at the end of his life displayed the most amazing bravery. But the man, perhaps above others, who was a great preacher, comparable, I think, with John Knox in Scotland, was Hugh Latimer, the Bishop of Worcester, who basically lived to an old age, 80-year-old, before he was burnt at the stake at Oxford. Come back to that later on next time. It was to the Edwardian Reformation, I believe, what Knox was in Scotland. He was an able and popular preacher. There's two famous paintings of Latimer. This isn't one of them, actually. This is another one, just a portrait. But there's two famous paintings of Cranmer preaching first of all before Edward, and then in the open air. I'll say more about him later. But the man, I believe, above all, who was the most established reformer, was the next man. This was John Hooper. Now, he's dressed very formally there, but basically, he's the most interesting person. He came to Protestant views in 39, so towards the end of Henry's reign. He was chaplain to Sir Thomas Arundel. He was then a teacher at Oxford University, but he was restricted by the professor of divinity. So what he did was move to Basel in Switzerland, where he was influenced by the reformers Bullinger, Bucer, and Alaska. He returned to England in 1547 after Henry's death. He then became chaplain to Somerset, the protector that I mentioned, in 1549. And he was then offered the bishopric of Gloucester in 1550. Now, he did not accept this at first, and the reason is very interesting. Basically, this is the vestments controversy, and it shows Hooper in a very interesting light. Basically, he refused at first to wear the vestments associated with the office of bishop. And I think it shows great insight and the highly reformed views that he had. It was a critical point, and I believe basically it's something that had repercussions later, because basically it became an issue in Elizabeth's reign, which I'll come to later, and particularly in the bishopric of Laud in the period of Charles I, the successor to James I, 100 years later. And in the 19th century, particularly, the so-called Tractarian movement in the Church of England, men like Newman and Pusey and Keble and Froude, who basically were next door to being Roman Catholics and exercised an influence on the Church of England. Now, remarkably, I think, Ryle was not too sympathetic to Hooper, but he saw the problems that these men caused in the Church of England in his own time, not just 100 or 200 years later. I believe he had great insight. But basically, this is what Ryle said, how he commented on that. Yielding ground on the secondary issues is not compromise, but wise spirituality when peace was threatened. Well, I think we can argue on that particular one. Should he have stood down, or was he right to accept the vestments for the sake of peace? I think we can have an argument over that. But Hooper was the strongest and most doctrinally sound of the reformers. He was a man of great vision. He was a benefactor to the poor. In fact, he was an incipient Puritan with separatist tendencies. Separation of church and state was part of his brief and part of his statements when he preached. I can only say, if only Hooper had been in charge instead of Cranmer. But anyway, that was not the case. There were others too who were strong. Ridley, who was Bishop of London, associated with Latimer, of course. Bilney, Rogers, Roland Taylor, rector of the Hadley Church in Norfolk, Bradford, and Ferrer, David Ferrer, who was Bishop of St. David's in Wales. These men were together to consolidate the Protestant Reformation. But sadly, and we'll come to this next time, all were martyrs in the reign of Mary Tudor. Now, the fourth point here, again, which does not put good light on Cranmer, was the burning controversy. First of all, there was a political change. Opposition to Somerset became great within the council, and particularly that opposition was led by John Dudley, who was Earl of Warwick at the particular time. And basically, in the year of 1549, Somerset, who had agreed to the execution of his own brother, was deposed as protector of England and replaced by Dudley, who created himself Duke of Northumberland. Nobody created him, he created himself, Duke of Northumberland. Near the end of Edward's life, Northumberland persuaded Edward to nominate Lady Jane Grey to succeed him so that he might have a Protestant succession. That was very much in his mind. Well, he achieved that. He was persuaded, Edward, and he then arranged a marriage between his son Guildford and the 15-year-old Jane. Unfortunately, from Northumberland's point of view, on Jane, she despised Guildford, who had, we have told, nothing to commend him except his good looks. It's a very interesting biography, and I do urge you to read it. It's the biography of Faith Cook on Lady Jane Grey. It's excellent. But what happened, the marriage was arranged between his family, between Northumberland's family, and between Frances, the mother of Lady Jane. Lady Jane at first refused, but she was badly beaten by her mother. You read the account of that. I know it seems incredible, but she was badly beaten by her mother until she agreed to the marriage, which then took place. So Northumberland began to achieve his purpose. Of course, he would reign through them when Jane came to the throne. But the burning of John Butcher is, again, basically something that was really an incident which put very bad light not only on Cranmer but the king himself, but rather more Cranmer than the king. Who was John Butcher? Well, John Butcher was basically of a community in East Anglia of Anabaptists, and she was a very vocal critic of Cranmer, very vocal critic. Now, just about the Anabaptists then, before we come to that. Their beliefs included separation of church and state, and the communion as a memorial service with no change in the bread and wine, more or less the position of the reformers of England. And this lady persisted in criticizing Cranmer, and Cranmer became fed up with her and imprisoned her. But then things took a turn beyond that. And I'm very grateful to John for giving me these two books on this particular period. And I'd just like to read the section concerning this lady, Jane Butcher. The first test of Edward's convictions came in early summer, that's 1549, with the case of the heretic Joan Butcher, the wife of a London butcher who had long troubled Cranmer with her Anabaptist views. Despite her imprisonment and formal excommunication, Joan refused to recant her beliefs. Edward recalled how she had been arrested a year later, but kept in hope of conversion. On the 30th of April, one last attempt was made to see her, so that she might see reason, but she was refused. Now, this is what Joan said. "It is not long ago that you burned Anne Ascough." Now, that was the Anne Askew, an alternative rendering of his name. And she, if you remember, was a friend of Catherine Parr, Queen Catherine Parr. And she was badly tortured and then taken in a chair to be burned at the stake. Now, ultimately, Cranmer was responsible for that. So she goes on. "It was not long ago that you burned Anne Ascough for a piece of bread." That is for his views, for her views rather, on communion. She denied, rightly, the physical presence of Christ in the communion. Now, Cranmer seemed to often waver over this particular matter, but basically, that's what happened. And then she goes on, "Yet you yourself came to believe the doctrine for which you burnt her." And that appeared to be true. What after that? And basically, after such procrastination, a final decision was taken to send her to the flames. This Edward refused to countenance, and despite his tutor's Cheek's opinion, all the council could not move him to put his hand to the warrant. Eventually, Cranmer was called in, yet neither could he, with much labour, induce the king to sign the warrant. "What, my lord?" Edward reasoned. Will you help me send her quick to the devil in error? Cranmer later confessed that he had never so much to do in his life as to cause the king to put to his hand to the warrant. He didn't. This matter was resolved only when the Archbishop agreed to Edward's demands. They would lay all the charge thereof upon Cranmer before God. So eventually he passed the book and said, I'm free of the blood of this woman. It's on your hands. And on 2nd of May 1550, Joan was burnt at the stake. A very sad event, which I think besmirches the opinions of Edward and his resolution to carry through the Protestant Reformation. It's a slur, of course, too, on Cranmer. Neither was guiltless in this situation, of course, but Cranmer more so than the king. Then if we move on to the death of Edward, he succumbed increasingly to infirmities, and he died at Greenwich Palace in 1553 at the age of 15. But interestingly, he had this prayer on his deathbed: O Lord, defend this realm from papistry. Now, though in the long term, of course, this prayer was definitely answered, for the next 5 years, there was an extremely dark age in the history of this particular country. The dark age of Mary, that is, Mary Tudor, not Mary Stuart. But it's lightened, I believe, by the description of the bravery of those who led the Reformation, the men that I mentioned in particular, and not least, I'm going to deny myself, and not least the bravery of Thomas Cranmer at the very end, after a further vacillation. So we'll look at that, hopefully, next time. And thanks for listening. Oh, one further thing. There was a controversy over the death of Edward, and just like to read you this passage. The jury is still out on the nature of Edward's fatal illness. A gathering of expert medical opinion from Professor Paul Beeson and Dr. Trevor Hughes by the late Jennifer Loach, and her study of the rain question, the usual suggestion of tuberculosis, and suggests, she rules that out and suggests complication brought on by pyogenic pneumonia or bronchopneumonia, which led to a general septicemia. So that's a variation, because they usually, if you read in history books, they do mention tuberculosis, but these people have studied the description of the symptoms of Edward before he died and come to that particular conclusion. Well, shall we turn to our hymn books?